Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Eco Money on Money FM 89.3.
That's right. It's time for Eco Money with me, Audrey Seek. China, the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, has started making inroads in the green energy transition. In recent years, the world's second largest economy has pumped in investments in major renewable energy projects, such as developing new offshore wind farms and large-scale clean energy bases that combine solar and wind farms. Currently, China produces 31% of its electricity from renewable sources, including wind, solar, hydroelectricity, and geothermal. But even though the country is still heavily reliant on coal, estimates predict that by 2026, solar will overtake fossil fuels as China's leading energy source. For more insights, we're joined by Ivy Yin, market specialist for energy transition and carbon at S&P Global. Good morning, Ivy. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. Actually, I'm currently in Beijing for the Clean Energy Expo. So I think this theme is really perfectly fit for today's topic.
What perfect timing. Thanks so much for joining us from Beijing, and it's great to have you this morning. So let's start with China's overall commitment to clean energy. Investments hit a staggering 6.8 trillion yuan. That's about 940 billion US dollars in 2024 with a steady 7% annual growth rate. So how is this investment reshaping China's energy landscape, and what does it mean for its position in global renewables?
I think definitely China's climate leadership is evident. It has the world's largest renewable generation capacity. According to our statistic, in 2024 alone, China installed 277 gigawatt of solar PV. To put that number into context, that capacity addition in 2024 alone actually surpassed any other country's total capacity added in history. So basically, China is dominating the global renewable capacity addition. However, the question is always how or whether the investment can translate into profits or steady returns. Actually, some of this, for example, solar PV plants are in desert area, rural China. I also heard just now we're talking about offshore wind power projects. Some are in distant offshore areas. So actually the profitability of this kind of project are still relatively nascent because you have to have powerful power grid. In Singapore, we also have that power grid challenge. We need very mature long-distance power lines to ensure the power transmission is stable, and we can coordinate power supply demand in different regions. In China, that infrastructure is still developing, so this kind of distant projects are still not so profitable despite the heavy investment. Also, if you look at upstream, the manufacturing industries, made in China, solar PV, electric vehicles, batteries, they're also encountering trade barriers from major export markets like the EU, India, and US. So for the upstream, there's also investment uncertainties. So I see the achievements are significant, but some uncertainties are also significant.
Okay. So speaking of, profitability and money, we are seeing a real economic shift here. Clean energy contributed a record 10% to China's GDP last year, making it a pretty key driver of growth. So what does this tell us about China's long-term industrial and economic policies moving forward, do you think?
Actually, for China, there's a definition called 新三样, which means 3 new pillars that drives the country's economic growth. That is electric vehicles, lithium battery, and solar PV modules. From the number I just got from the Beijing Clean Energy Expo, they said the 3 new economic pillars contribute to around 200 billion yuan of export values for 4 consecutive years. To put the number into Singapore dollar, that's 37 billion Singapore dollars. Yeah, so basically these 3 new pillars, China is not only doing this for climate purpose or decarbonization. They really look at these sectors as new economic stimulus. And also we have some interesting finding in our recent research. These new sectors also become able to digest the overcapacity in some conventional sectors. One important sector is steel, we all know China's property sector nowadays have some problem, and their steel output cannot be digested by those conventional sectors' demand. So actually these new sectors, especially solar PV and electric vehicles, becomes the new demand side for the conventional commodities. Yeah.
Okay. We also understand that the government has rolled out some new guidelines to manage special clean energy funds from 2025 to 2029, and that's focused on natural gas, and that's regarded as cleaner energy in China's context. Can you possibly explain what is the role of gas as kind of like a bridging fuel in China's energy transition?
Yes, actually in China, natural gas is treated differently from coal or crude oil in its overall energy plan. Actually, natural gas is very, essential to combo or bundle with renewables to ensure stable power supplies. And for that particular special fund policy actually is to stimulate domestic production of natural gas, especially special or unconventional natural gas like shale gas. Basically, in the past, China heavily relies on imports of LNG from Australia, Qatar, Malaysia, but also from US and Russia. So basically, that special fund is to intensify or strengthen natural gas role as the bridging fuel and boosting China's domestic production in order to reduce this kind of import dependency, enhance energy security amid the geopolitical difficulties or uncertainties.
Okay. And we also know that China has reportedly set a target of 10,000 gigawatts of wind and solar capacity by 2060. So what are the biggest financial and policy hurdles when it comes to reaching that goal? And how far along is China right now from this dream?
Actually, for China, officially, I think they only have a 2030 target. That is 1,200 gigawatt of solar and wind capacity by 2030. And China's 2024 capacity is already 1,400 gigawatt, which means they already met the 2030 target 6 years ahead of time. But if we look at longer term, as you mentioned, 2060, actually the challenge is big because if you want a renewable dominant system, you want renewable to be as reliable or stable as coal or gas. That is very challenging. For example, you must have those utility scale energy storage. We don't always have wind blows or sunlight. So we need the big batteries to provide the buffer supplies when the solar and wind supplies are insufficient. And we need to, as I mentioned, China is so big and they have resources in the west, in the middle, but they have intensified demand in the east coastal areas where you have like higher population density, faster economic development. So you need to have long distance power transmission in order to coordinate, for example, power supply from Inner Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and demand from Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangdong. So this kind of long-distance power coordination transmission is very essential for China to further expand the capacity and coordinate the supply and demand imbalance. The other thing is on the demand side, we know China have heavy or increasingly developed electric vehicle sectors, which means we have those volatile power demand. So at any time, there could be an EV plug into the charging facility. And in the past, we don't have those kind of volatile demand. So on the demand side, the power grid also need to become smarter, need to be upgraded in order to adapt to all these kind of changes.
Okay, yeah. So you need to adapt to all of these different moving parts. And of course, even though we've seen significant effort on China's part, we also can't ignore the elephant in the room, right? China is still the world's biggest coal consumer, still heavily reliant on coal, and is also the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases per unit of energy. So with this in mind, how would you assess China's recent reforms in renewable energy pricing, and how do these reforms then affect the financial viability and competitiveness of renewable energy projects in China?
Yeah, I think that heavy emission intensity is largely because majority of China's power supply are still from coal. Actually, if you look at generation capacity, more than half are already like renewable. But if you look at actual electricity supply, the actual supply majority are from coal still, because this is kind of like the systematic challenge I just spoke, because if we don't have that sufficient storage, we don't have the powerful transmission lines, we need to address volatility. So unfortunately, coal-fired and gas-fired power still do well or do better than renewables nowadays in addressing all these challenges. But regarding the policy reform you mentioned, I think that's called Notice 136, which is very impactful on China's power market, especially renewable sectors. Yesterday, I had a conversation with one very prestigious energy policy advisor in China. He told me for that particular notice, it's to stop babysitting the renewable sector. In the past, China have some very rigid policy. For example, if you're a renewable supplier, we have a guaranteed purchase mechanism. We ask the grid company for every year you must procure that volume at that price. But actually, it can be a financial burden to those grid companies sometime and affect their financial performances as well. And also they have mandatory target. Because renewables are unstable, you must install certain capacity of battery storage or pumps, hydro storage, for example, in order to coordinate that power supplies. But actually, all those mandatory targets sometimes are financial burdens. And the renewable capacity already becomes so huge. It's half of China's generation capacity. So basically what the advisor told me is we should stop babysitting the sector, because that sector now has become really big. You don't want a giant baby. You want the sector to develop into a mature adult, right? So basically that Notice 136 is to make renewable project developers to enter the power market, to join the wet-hot competition, let supply demand decide the price, let it compete with coal-fired and gas-fired electricity in a real battle.
All right. Well, Ivy, we can't let you go without bringing in the U.S. Really briefly. With Trump shifting climate change lower on the priority list, China's role in international climate finance, including funding green projects in developing countries, has sort of positioned it a global leader of sorts. So how does this position China on the world stage when it comes to climate diplomacy then?
Well, I think people are usually talking about the disruption brought by Trump 2.0 era, but actually reducing dependency on China's clean energy products is a bipartisan agenda. It actually starts from Trump 1.0 era, continues during former Joe Biden administration as well. So our recent research showed China's diversification of export market start actually a decade ago. Currently, their dependency on the U.S. markets is weaker and weaker over time, especially for core products like solar PV modules. Well, for climate strategy, actually, the U.S. exit of the Paris Agreement could be opportunity for China to strengthen its climate leadership, especially partnering with developing countries, exporting their product, developing renewable projects, and building factories along the Belt and Road. China is currently promoting the Green Belt and Road Initiative on top of the conventional BRI. And under the Paris Agreement, actually the initial design was for developed countries to provide climate finance to developing countries. But China, as a developing country, have already voluntarily provided around, I think, 177 billion yuan. That is also over 30 billion Singapore dollars to other developing countries. For people who are interested in climate geopolitics, I recommend you to look at S&P's Road to COP series. COP is at the end of this year in Brazil, COP 30. And it is interesting because it's a Brazil COP. The host country is Brazil. China, Brazil, India, South Africa, they have that very solid basic bloc, which is a partnership among like-minded countries who have common political interest as emerging developing economies. I think it provides a stage, especially U.S. is not on that negotiating table. It provides an opportunity for the basic countries to actually voice out concerns, stronger voices as developing countries. For example, the carbon tariff set by the EU, the climate finance for developing countries, they have a bigger stage and more spotlight to talk about these controversial issues between global north and south.
Yeah, well, we're definitely looking forward to COP30 that's coming up this year. And it's clear that China's massive investments and policy shifts are shaping not just its own future, but also the global energy landscape. Ivy, thanks so much for joining us all the way from Beijing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Ivy Yin, market specialist for energy transition and carbon at S&P Global. Keep it here on Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.